Okay, we will. Oh, someone has their hand up. Ross, did you want to say something?
No, I just wasn't certain whether you could see me until I clicked the correct button.
No worries. Yeah, I can see you. No worries.
Okay.
We'll just wait. I think we'll get going now. So I'm going to just mute you there. But if you do want to say anything, then please do pop up your hands. Maybe we'll have a question and answer thing at the end anyway. So if you can wait till the end, that would be awesome. So I'm Natalie. I'm your host. I'm one of the Wildside board members. If we have any internet connections or anything that fails, just bear with me. We were a few more of us, but it's just me now this evening. So just a bit about Wildside. Wildside Golden is connected to one of the regional networks of Wildside offices, Creston, Elk Valley, Kimberley, Cranbrook and Invermere. And we work closely with all of these organisations to extend protection to all areas in the East Kootenays and the Columbia Valley. We are located in Golden, and we do most of the work in the upper Columbia Valley between Spillimachine and Meeker. Our main objective is to work to maintain biodiversity and healthy human communities in and around our region. Our focus is on protecting the high ecological values of the Columbia Headwaters region, one of the richest and most biologically diverse regions in the world. As part of our community outreach and education, we are pleased to welcome you to our 2023 Winter Speaker Series, Creatures Great and Small. We are pleased to be offering this series on the traditional lands and unceded territories of the Ktunaxa, Secwepemc nations and the home to the Métis Nation of the Columbia River. We also want to thank the Town of Golden for their sponsorship of this series. And thank you for your interest. And now I'd like to introduce Mirjam. Mirjam is a Wolverine researcher, PhD student, conservation biologist, climber, ultra runner, and backcountry skier. As a child, wildlife and nature documentaries inspired her to become an adventurer and a biologist. As a wildlife researcher, she is passionate about exploring creative ways to make scientific research accessible to a broad audience and to inspire others to get interested and involved in conservation themselves. So now I'm going to pass over to Mirjam.
All right, so I got that here. Try to share my screen. Is that working now? You see my main screen? Okay. Yeah, hey, welcome all of you that can make it tonight. I'll tell you a bit about Wolverines, about some of the recent research that we've been doing. And yeah, the topic of the talk is Wolverines in a changing landscape and the warming climate. I'll talk about the changing landscape a lot more than the warming climate, but both these things affect our work quite a bit. And I am really looking forward to some questions at the end. And yeah, so keep them there. So the work that I'm talking about is part of my PhD project at the University of Calgary. I started that in 2017, but I'm not doing it all by myself, right? Like, so there's a whole lot of people involved. I listed 5 people here that are co-authors of the recent paper that I talk about most, but there's probably another 100 or 200 people that have been involved strongly or in one way or another, and that I won't mention in person here. But again, this is all teamwork. And when I say we, I mean different groups of people. But yeah, it's never usually just me that does any of these things. So yeah, I'd like to also acknowledge where we are. I'm in Golden, as probably all of you are, or some of you are, but the work that that I've been doing spans a very big area. So the land that I mostly talk about today is provincial lands in BC and Yoho Kootenay Banff National Park. And those are unceded and traditional and current territory of a lot of different nations. So the Tunaha and the Swaknak is the biggest area probably, but we go all the way up to Valemount. There might be other nations too that I haven't included here. Here in Golden, there's the Métis, and then in Banff, there's the Treaty 6, 7, 8 nations, as well as Métis there as well. So it's a very big, complex area for a lot of First Nations, and yeah. So this research is also part of a much larger study with many partners and funders, so it can get complex to talk about that too. So the work that I'm presenting is mostly done by the University of Calgary, Yellowstone to Yukon, and Parks Canada, and NSERC, but there's the bigger project has been funded by a lot more people that are all, and a lot more groups and individual people. So yeah, very big project. And yeah, now I kind of would like to tell a little bit more about what a wolverine is. Most people have heard of it by now, a big change since 2011 when I started, when many people didn't even really know that they aren't just a Marvel comic. So I think we've come a long way to explain what we'll like to kind of, yeah, explain what Wolverines are to a larger public here in British Columbia. So that's really cool. We've put a lot of effort into trying to reach a lot of people just because we think it's an important species, it's an intriguing species. Wolverines are large mathelid, so they're part of the weasel family, like pine marten, ermines, otters, those things. They are pretty small, 10 to 20 kilos. So that's about a mid-sized dog. And they're carnivores. And that's also where their reputation comes from, right? So while they're pretty small, they do have a very big reputation. So the top left picture here, you see a caribou carcass and a wolverine on it. And so wolverines scavenge and they hunt. Scavenging means they eat things that are already dead. And they hunt anything from voles, the smallest creatures, to ungulates. We're not quite sure what the biggest thing is that they can take down, but it's probably bigger than we think. So they do have a wide prey base, which is probably a really good thing for them. They eat snowshoe hares, porcupines, deer, ungulates, sheep. I think some of them eat birds. And that probably gives them a little bit of a hope for the future, as some of their main prey species have been disappearing for the landscape, especially the caribou. We don't really know how successful they are when they're hunting. They aren't really that gung-ho. So the lower left picture I took with a cell phone camera, because I was visiting somebody who had some semi-tame wolverines. And my experience with wolverines in the wild and in these tame ones are that they're really quite polite and curious and friendly. Like they're not running up to you, they're like very careful, investigate. So they don't seem that threatening. But then a couple of years ago, I came across this video here. It's from YouTube, from Norway, where some people filmed a wolverine that was attacking a reindeer. And that kind of opened my eyes quite a bit, because we never really see them hunt in real life. So now that everyone has a cell phone, it's really good because there's a lot more, for whatever reason, it's using my my previous times. So yeah, so we don't usually see them hunt. So you see how the wolverine just attacks the reindeer like into its face. So yeah, that was a bit of an eye opener for what they can do. And maybe also shows us just that we shouldn't underestimate those smaller carnivores. So a little bit more about what wolverines are. So they do have a pretty big reputation. And one of the reputations is that they travel really far. So that is all true. So wolverines have very similar space requirements as grizzly bears that are like so much bigger. So the need between a female wolverine needs between about 100 to 500 square kilometers to have enough resources to raise young. So that's their territory size, their home range size. And the male has about 2 or 3 times that, 500 to 2,000 square kilometers. So very similar to grizzly bears. The very big difference between wolverines and grizzly bears is though that wolverines are territorial. That means they defend their territory from other animals of the same sex. So females against females, males against males, if they're not related to them. Grizzly bears are different. They have a home range, but they don't defend it. So that's also part of the reason why there's usually a lot more grizzly bears on the landscape than wolverines. In Banff National Park, for example, there's about 3 to 4 grizzly bears for every wolverine. So, and that's kind of between 4 and 8 grizzly bears per wolverine. So if you think grizzly bears are rare, then wolverines are extra rare. And the left picture here is a map of telemetry locations of wolverines in east of Anchorage in Alaska. And the different colors are different individuals. And it really shows how many of them that are not related, they will not intrude into each other's territory. So to defend it, it means they actively run around these large areas. And for example, the red and the green one, I think these are 2 males. Or no, actually one's a male, and the light green one's a male and the red one is a male. And because they will fight to the death over a territory, they are very good at adhering to the borders. So they keep going around, marking it. And as long as the neighbor is still here, the other neighbor probably stays out of it just because it's too dangerous. And those wolverines here, the colors that overlap are either males and females or females and their offspring. And that's another neat thing about wolverines. So on the right, you see a picture with 2 pictures with 3 wolverines. And even though wolverines are known to be solitary, they are also pretty social within their family. So this is on both photos. It's a female in the Northern Selkirks with her two daughters. Here they're about a year old, and they stuck around in her territory for another year. And wolverines will do that. So especially the daughters will stick around in their mother's territories for another year or 2 or 3, and they usually inherit a part of the mother's territory. Once they become older, the mom gives them a part. So it helps them to like be in a place that they know, so that they're more successful to raise their own young. And because wolverines have so little offspring, often they don't have more than 1 or 2 surviving daughters, so they can totally like give part of the territory to the 1 or 2 daughters they have. But that's also part of why they're pretty vulnerable. They have very few young, like every 2 or 3 years they give birth. So they're really quite sensitive to a lot of disturbances. Okay, going into our research. What was the motivation for doing another big project that's now in its 6th year? We don't usually just do that for fun, right? Like these are big, expensive projects, a ton of work, lots of people involved. So we needed to have a good reason to want to do this project. And one of the main reasons is that we have worked on a number of different wolverine projects in the region since 2010. And one of the main findings was that there were very low numbers of wolverines in the Southern Rockies and the Southern Kootenays. So if you like maps, here on the right is another map. This is the Kootenay region. The black is where there's quite a few wolverines, and the white is where there's virtually none or none. So there's a lot of areas that are wolverine habitat where there just are hardly any individuals. It's not really a population, it's just a wolverine here or there. So we didn't expect that. We thought they'd be everywhere. And we found that there's lots of areas with few wolverines. We also found that they mostly overlapped the protected areas, but for a number of different reasons, we couldn't really tease out why they were in some areas, but not in others. We learned that harvest was not sustainable in this region. So that's one big thing. I'll talk about this a little bit later. But we also learned at the same time from a study from the US that wolverines are impacted by winter recreation in their habitat use, especially females. So, and we knew that there was quite a bit of winter recreation in our study area. And another reason why we wanted to do this research is that we had very little idea of where the reproductive females are. As I said, they have very few young, so each female wolverine is quite precious. And we wanted to learn where they are, which ones are the more important areas to protect or to just maybe treat better. And then the last reason was that we knew that in 2018, wolverines were going to be listed under the Canadian Species at Risk Act because there's a lot of conservation concerns across the country, right? If this was just a local thing that we found, oh, there's some areas with no wolverines, that'd be concerning, right? But that would be just local. But we knew that there were much bigger issues in the country, and we wanted to be prepared. So I'm getting forced here to talk about wolverine trapping, which is good. So this is a question that often comes up. Wolverines are harvested in much of Canada where they occur. And I just quickly want to describe how that works from a regulation perspective, because many people don't know. So wolverines are trapped, they're regulated by region, like all other fur bearers. Like there's some overall laws that people have to follow, but each region sets its own targets and makes some decision independently, like the biologists make decisions independently because the regions are so different, right? There's often things that apply to one area, but not to the other. And in each region, across the whole province, there's registered trap lines, which are just areas. And those give licensed trappers exclusive access to the fur-bearing animals that live on their trap line, like squirrels or martens or wolverines or lynx, anything that people are allowed to trap. And trappers usually have to buy those trap lines from other trappers. So they're not private land, but they get the right to trap. At this point, wolverines are harvestable in regions 3, 5, 6, 7A, and 7B, so most of the province. And where it is allowed, wolverines are harvestable, like trappers are allowed to take unlimited wolverines every year on their trap line. So there's really no limit. And there's a couple issues with that. One is that wolverine harvest data is often unreliable and underreported. And the other issue is that the government actually has no idea how many wolverines there are. So essentially we've been going blind for a long time. And there's also virtually no data on First Nation harvests. So to give you a bit more understanding for why wolverines might be or have been over-harvested in this region and might be over-harvested in other regions as well is, so the map on the lower, on the lower right here, I put all the BC trap lines over the map. So each little black area with a black rim is a trap line. And in the Kootenay region where we are located, there are about 250 trap lines. And in 2016, we estimated there were about 170 wolverines. And there's probably fewer now than 7 years ago. So there's more trappers than wolverines, right? So if every trapper had the right to take at least one wolverine, or to take as many wolverines as they wanted every year. So if every trapper in 1 year decided to try to take a wolverine, we'd probably be out of wolverines in a couple of years. But that hasn't happened, even though there's so many trappers, and that's because most trappers do not actually target wolverine or even capture them. So only a handful, about 10 to 15 every year, capture wolverines in BC. Unfortunately, in the Kootenay region, unfortunately, that was enough to really impact the population. So in Region 4, the harvest got closed in 2020 because of data that we and colleagues collected, because it wasn't sustainable. And I want to say that the government essentially has not collected any wolverine population data in the province before, outside of our research. So that's just something to be aware. It's not that the trappers did something they weren't supposed to, it's that there was essentially no direction given for what's appropriate and what is not. So recent study. The one part of my PhD that we finished, or that we already published, is centered around the national parks. It's a little bit hard to see. So here is Yoho on the right. You see Yoho, Kootenay, and Banff National Park. We looked at the numbers from 2 wolverine surveys, the one we did in 2011 to 13 with Tony Clevenger, and the one we recently did 2018 to 2020, that were in and outside of the parks. And then we were able to also use the remote camera data from the EI monitoring by Parks Canada that have hundreds of cameras on the landscape every year for each of the years of the study. Sorry for that. And so we were able to combine those 3 data sets into a long-term analysis to give us a really good idea for how the population is doing. The methods that we used, were comparatively simple. So on the left here, the remote cameras from Parkscano is essentially just cameras on trees and at trails, rock trees, paths, game trails, all sorts of places that put them to try to get a sense for how many animals there are of like large mammals, everything. That just monitor everything. They also take photos of people, which was very helpful in our case. On the top right, you see a picture of our past method where we used collected DNA from wolverines. We nailed beavers onto trees a few meters up, and then wolverines climbed the tree, and we got their hair samples. And on the bottom is a photo of the most recent study. That's also what I've been doing across the entire region for my PhD, where we put rump holes up on trees. And that gives us more information because we can also recognize wolverines by their chest pattern. And we can see at the bottom here, you see like their belly. We can see if they're lactating or pregnant, not pregnant, lactating, have given birth to juveniles, or if they're males or females. So it gives us a lot more information, and it's a lot more fun to look at photos rather than just hair samples. And I'll show you a couple of videos here. How the setup is. On the left, you see there's a run pole on a tree, and then the bait is hanging off the top. This wolverine has a hurt paw. I don't know what happened. And then on the right here, you see on the left that was a female. On the right, that's a male. It's not his first site that he found, but this is his first time at this site. And you see how he's a little bit careful, trying to get at the bait. Bait is really, like bait and lure is a really good way to get wolverines to our site. If we didn't have bait involved, it would be virtually impossible to detect wolverines, to find them, just because there's so few on the landscape and they use such large areas that we will be, unless we offer them give them some reason to come, they would not want to come and give us their information, right? Their hair samples, their ID. So it's been a lot of fun, a lot of work to put all these things up. About every 150 square kilometers, we put a site up and got a whole bunch of information on wolverines. And let's talk about findings. Sorry, I overloaded this slide a little bit. The main thing that we found was not very fun, was not very good. So we found that from 2011 on the left here to 2020, the number of wolverines in our study area went from about 54 animals to about 32. And 25 of those were females at first, and then at the end of the study, there were about 15 females. And the study area was pretty big. It's about 30,000 square kilometers, which is roughly the same size as Vancouver Island, right? So 54 animals on Vancouver Island is already not very many. And 32, that's nearly 40% less, or a decline of about 7.5% each year. That was very unexpected and pretty big. Like we had kind of thought that the number in the national parks would stay roughly the same over those 10 years, which wasn't the case. And when we dug in a little bit bigger here in green, we have the numbers for inside the national parks. It's only about 10,000 square kilometers, so a third of the study area is parks. There we had about 3.6 animals per 1,000 square kilometers. And that's just a measure so we can compare across regions, right? Like every 1,000 square kilometers has 3.5 animals. That went down to about 2.1. So a pretty big drop. And if we looked at the area outside the national parks on provincial lands in Alberta and BC, we went from about 0.9 per 1,000 to 0.5 per 1,000. And this is all wolverine habitat. There is not really a good reason why there shouldn't be any wolverines there. And when you remember that each female uses about 100 to 500 square kilometers, in 1,000 square kilometers should be between 2 and 5 females, right? So there should be at least already 2, or there should be a lot more. So like a good density would be about 5 animals per 1,000 square kilometers, not 0.9, or maybe it goes up to about 7 or 8. But so this is really quite low, and it was especially surprising because it was within a very large protected area. And these are some more of our findings. Graphs are sometimes difficult to understand. I'll try to walk you through here. So on the top 2 panels are the main factors that impacted density. So density is just the number of animals on a landscape. The main factor was spring snow, and that was something that we expected. So we know that there's more wolverines in places where there's more spring snow for a lot of different reasons. And that's also why they're vulnerable to changes in climate, especially as the snow gets less and less. They just won't be able to do as well, to compete as well, to raise their young. There's a whole lot of reasons why a loss of spring snow cover is going to be an issue for them in the long term. So we confirmed that. That wasn't surprising. On the right side, we have nightlight intensity, which is measured by satellites. And it's essentially just a measure for built up areas, like developed areas have more nightlight. So, so that means places where people build things and they actually also use, because yeah, if it's just a trail but nobody uses it, that would still be a developed area, but it doesn't show up in this data set. We really were only interested in where people are actively living. So that line goes down. That means the more nightlight intensity there was, the more built up area, the fewer wolverines. And nightlight intensity is also on the bottom panel. And these two factors impact the detection, which also means they show where wolverines are within their home range, right? Like if a wolverine is there, but you don't find it in a certain place, that means that that often means that they're avoiding a certain area. And this happened in the national parks. So we found that on the right side here, wolverines, it goes down. Wolverines avoided areas with more nightlight. So you wouldn't find as many wolverines, even if they existed closer to, let's say, Banff, Lake Louise, all the places, chalets, all the places with lights. And on the left is the more concerning factor. So we were able to look at how many people are using, are also detected by the cameras that detected the wolverines. And we found that the number of trail user groups per 2-week period here really impacted whether wolverines used an area. And the really surprising thing was that as few as 2 or 3 people groups per 2 weeks, it could be 1 person or 10 people, just one group that travels together. As few as 2 to 3 groups per week really started to impact whether we would see wolverines, whether they would use that area. And we knew that at some point people would make wolverines avoid areas, but we didn't think that it was at such low thresholds. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in a couple of slides. So the key result of our study that we published is that there's been a very unexpected and very large population decrease in the Rocky Mountains, in those central Rocky Mountains within and outside of the national parks, about 7% loss each year over 10 years. The parks did comparatively well. So inside the parks, the numbers also went down, but there was about 3 times more wolverines per area than outside. So that was a good thing. However, inside the parks, there was an impact of recreation and human footprint. And wolverines avoided places with very few people visits. Again, as few as 2 to 3 groups per 2 weeks started to noticeably impact whether wolverines were seen on those cameras. And outside of the parks, we found that the harvest rates were much too high. That wasn't surprising either. We knew that 2011 to 13 to 15, the harvest rates were too high, and that just kept going right up to 2020. So in the last few years, a quarter of the population would get harvested every year. Even more, in one case, it was 45% of the population got harvested. And that sounds really drastic. These were only about 8 or 9 wolverines, but because there's so few of them, 8 or 9 wolverines can be a large number. If there's only 25 wolverines or 30 wolverines, then 8 are a large part of those, right? The good news is that the harvest was closed just after our project ended because of those previous concerns. So at least this is not going to keep going now. For 2 years, there has not been any harvest. So that's a good thing. Unfortunately, wolverines don't rebound very fast, but that's I'm glad that the province took those measures. And so what we found with regards to recreation pretty much matched what we had expected from this study in Idaho, Wyoming and Montana, that where researchers did a very large study on winter recreation from 2010 to 2016, and which directly motivated me to do my PhD work. If you want more information on that, it's on their website, roundriver.org. They have a lot of information there on what they did. But the main findings that they had with regards to wolverines was essentially that female wolverines avoided areas in their territory that have too much winter recreation, and very specifically too much dispersed winter recreation. So off trail, like the ski touring or snowmobiling. And they found that essentially if there's just a little bit of ski touring or a little bit of snowmobiling, there's female wolverines with babies. And this is annoying. And if there's too much of either ski touring or snowmobiling or both, then the females would stay away. And in their study, they found that there were clear intensity thresholds and that the distribution of the recreation matters. So I tried to kind of make a picture here. On the left, you see very low intensity recreation, but if people are everywhere and the intensity is above the threshold that wolverines don't like, then there's very little space left for the females in pink here to still have a territory. Versus on the right, if there's a ton of people, but they're only in a very small area, the intensity can be huge and wolverines stay away, but there's a lot of room left for female wolverines. So one thing that we really want to find out, and we haven't fully finished yet, is because the way they measured people, it was a bit hard to replicate. So this study that we did, where we found that the avoidance was as low as 2 to 3 groups of people per 2 weeks, it's really helpful for us to see how that looks on a bigger scale outside the national parks. How many areas do we actually have where we have those thresholds, those levels of recreation? So how many areas, and will it impact just avoidance, or like will wolverines just stay away from like the busy areas, or will it actually mean that there won't be any females in some areas? And there's some really big, I'm not sure what's happening here. There's some really big implications of our findings. One of them is that the area that we're living in is a climate refugium. That means the Columbia Mountains, the Rocky Mountains, and Selkirks, Monoshis, Caribous, Purcells are forecast to stay quite cold, comparatively cold and wet over the next 100 to 200 years. So as the climate grows warmer, this is kind of one of the areas that really matter, where the climate for wolverines and many other species will remain somewhat better than in other places. So it's a really important area already today, but also in the future, where many other areas will not be suitable for those species anymore. Also, a big part of the Rocky Mountains is already protected, right? And still we find issues. And then the other issue is that our region has been a really crucial area for transboundary exchange of animals with the US. So the US essentially got rid of their wolverines in the last century, but they have been recovering since they stopped trapping them and putting out poison bait for the wolves. So wolverines have made a recovery in the US. There's about 200 or 300 animals now there, but they all came from Canada through these areas. So if this area doesn't have wolverines, it's going to be very difficult for those US wolverines to maintain their population. So it's a pretty important place. So realistically, we have to get it right here, right? We have to, this is important with regards to future climate. It's important because it's already protected. It's an important population on a bigger scale. So in my mind, we have to get it right here. We have to make sure wolverines stick around. And here is my bragging page. So often we do research and nothing happens. And for many scientists, we do science because we love it. And maybe a little bit different. I like to do science that people use and that helps with something. So it's been pretty cool to see how even just this last study, this part of my PhD has very actively led to things. So we've been able to update the harvest managers in Region 4 that were looking for a population trend. So they wanted to know how has it been since 2011, right? Should we keep that harvest ban alive or should we stop it? And I don't have an opinion on whether wolverines should be harvested or not, but what I was telling them was that the population has actually gone downhill even further. So that if they want to know if the population is going uphill or not, then we have to disappoint them. So that helped them make the decision what they want to do, and they decided to keep the harvest ban in place for now until they have reason to believe that the population has recovered. So we could give them that information right away, and they were able to look at it and implement it right away. Also, as we speak, the federal government is working on a wolverine management plan, and this data is one of the newer and better data sets. Is directly going into that federal management plan. I'm on their expert team, so we're able to like look at this data and very directly put it into the plan so that can inform policy at a later date. Right? We are not setting policy. We're scientists. We're just telling those people what's happening, and then other people the managers make the decisions. Right? So we published an open access peer-reviewed paper, which is on our website if you want to read it. That means that it's freely accessible to anyone who's interested in wolverines or recreation or conservation, and hopefully helps them. And we've given the data sets and some additional data to land managers in BC with national parks that might be interested in looking at ways to manage the animals and people and use on their land. So yeah, it's pretty cool that people are really interested. People want to know right away. I get emails, when do you have your next results? That's really rewarding to know that what we're doing actually can inform people really quite quickly. It doesn't necessarily always take 10 years for something to change. So what are our next research steps? My PhD is not quite done yet. I have another few months left to go and a lot of work still. So I'm still working on the biggest question, which is which human and natural factors affect wolverines. We really want to compare the different factors that impact wolverines on the big scale, not just that smaller area around the national parks, but the whole area from what is it about Bugaboos, Invermere to Valemount. So our main questions are, how do habitat changes, for example, by forestry, impact density and the females, and how does that compare to disturbances by human, for example, by recreation or roads? So we want to really put those things and compare those things in perspective, so we have an idea of what the main things are we need to focus on if we want to make sure that wolverines don't disappear. And then the second question is, we're looking at connectivity across roads and hydro lakes, just because we have some reason to believe that we'll go across roads very readily. So we're looking into that as well to see if we can confirm that or not. And here's the last slide. So I've talked a lot about what you're doing and science and this and data management. Most people want to also know what they can do. And there's quite a bit of things that you can do. If you want to learn more, go to our website, wolverinewatch.org, where we try to put, or let's be honest, where I try to put information on that's useful for all of you. So I manage the website for a number of different people. There's a number of people still involved in projects. You can read all about that on the website. And also there's a tab where you can report observations. So anytime you see tracks or a wolverine in British Columbia or across the continent, really, you can report it there, and it can help us with all sorts of things. And then the big thing we're working on right now is we're trying to get people to recognize and report wolverine dens, because we're finding that that's one of the most targeted conservation measures that can be taken by governments. If we do find active female dens, they're starting to give birth now in February. So February, March, April, May is the time where you may see wolverines if you go out ski touring or sledding. Obviously be careful with the current avalanche hazards. So this can help. We have 3 den sites now that governments have put in closures around the actual den site. So very targeted measures. We can't close down the entire backcountry. We don't want to, or they don't want to, and we shouldn't. But like these would be if we find more dens, we can do very targeted and hopefully useful measures to just let those females raise their babies in peace. The next thing is like recreate responsibly. That's a big ask. I don't always do it. But the main thing is get informed, get involved. And as there's going to be more and more guidelines and closures of certain areas, it's really crucial that people actually follow them and know why to follow them and talk to their friends, right? Like there's, we are working on more of these information things. Like it's the big topic now, because as we're learning, many species are actually getting affected by, if there's lots of people in the backcountry. So if you want to like be good stewards of the land, we should also be responsible ourselves. Don't get too close to animals, like avoid them when you see them, stay away, and all these things. And it depends a bit on which animal we're talking about, but yeah, be responsible. And the last thing is the most radical one. BC has not necessarily done all that great with regards to land and wildlife stewardship from a government level. So make yourself heard with your elected officials if that's something that you care about. We should all demand better policies, more funding for those things. And the most efficient way to do that is to talk to your elected officials. And here's the bonus Wolverine video. And that will be it for me.
Okay, once the video comes to an end there, if anybody does have any questions, please feel free to raise your hand, and as you raise your hands, I'll unmute you and you can ask your questions.
That's going to be it for the video.
Perfect. Anyone have any questions? One question in the chat. I have a question here regarding the trapping closure. Is that all trapping, and could wolverines be injured in smaller traps?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So the trapping closure was only for wolverines specifically, right? Like because there might not necessarily be, and it was purely based on sustainability. Like there just were more, the population's just too small to really sustain really any harvest in the Kootenay region right now. So, and because wolverines go into traps for other animals on occasion, there's not a very big, but there's a fair number of bycatches happening, as far as I'm told, by trappers and government biologists. So they can go into cougar traps, or they go into, sometimes they can even get stuck in marten traps. And yes, they can definitely get injured. I've seen wolverines coming with injuries from snares. They manage to get out of the wolf or the lynx snares, but then they might have big injuries. Some of them survive, some of them probably don't survive. So the government knows that there's kind of a background rate of injuries and death in traps. So that part, that's what I'm told. Like that wasn't my decision, obviously. Like that's what I'm told why the harvest of wolverines in the Kootenay region got closed, just because the inadvertent trapping and the injuries are already big enough that it just doesn't really, yeah, there just shouldn't really be any additional mortality through harvest. And I didn't even mention any of the road mortality. That's probably another factor that's probably not going to get better. So yeah, only wolverine harvest got closed, not the other animals. But yes, there's definitely an injury risk from other traps. I guess the next question is whether I have a favorite book about wolverines. Yeah, I think many of us, the book I was given to read when I started working on wolverines was The Wolverine Way by Dr. Chadwick. That's the Bible of wolverine things, because he's such a good writer and he talked about the science. We learned a lot about wolverines that you don't learn from research papers. So that's probably my favorite book. And here I have another book that's really fun. It's called, oh, the camera. Demon, oh no, Demon of the North. Can't really see it. By Peter Crott. I was given that by somebody who has raised a lot of Wolverines himself. It's an older book and it's very different from the Wolverine way, but it's somebody who had a lot of Wolverines and trapped them and sold them and wrote about them. So there's a lot of like really interesting tidbits about the animal that you might never, that you just don't get from researchers, because we usually just look at science, we don't write about like Wolverine's nature and what they do and how they are and their personality and like fun things and interesting facts. So Demon of the North by Peter Crott is really quite interesting. Here's another question. So are inadvertent trapping of Wolverines getting reported? Yes, sometimes they are. Last year, I think it was last year, somebody got a Wolverine in a foot black hole trap, and it didn't get hurt and it didn't die, and they went in with the COs and they released it. And I know that I talked to the trapper, and the Wolverine actually showed up at one of our sites afterwards and was healthy and happy. It didn't seem to suffer too much. It came to our site. So I think, okay, I would say from what I've heard from trappers that most trappers are very, they report what's happening. And yeah, there's probably a lot going on that never gets reported. So many people report things. But again, the government has also not really put in very much effort to make sure that they collect information, right? Like, I would not necessarily put this all at the feet of trappers. If the guidelines are either not there or so loose, or there's no information to do anything better, then you can't do anything different, right? You do what you're told to do, and if you're not asked to do something. So I feel like, yeah, some things get reported, but there's definitely a lot of room for improvement. And I think Ross has a question, if you want to unmute him.
Actually, it wasn't a question. I was just going to say that I agree Chadwick's book is great. He did give a presentation in Golden, I think it was about 5 years ago, that was really nice. And in addition to the Wolverine way, other listeners might be interested in knowing that he wrote an earlier book called A Beast the Color of Winter, which is about mountain goats. And it's just as poetic and fun to read as Wolverine Way.
And full of information. It's just,
Yes.
he's such an amazing writer, and he just tells things how they are, but he has his own, as he said, poetic way to it. So I think he used to be a scientist at some point, but that he realized he's much better as a writer.
Yes.
Here's another question by Linda. Does the federal Wolverine management plan cover the whole country? Yeah, so I only recently learned what those federal, it's written for the whole country. And that means there's a lot of things to take into account, because the country is very different, and issues we might have here do not apply to Nunavut, right? And issues they have in the Northwest Territories do not apply to Ontario. So we're putting a lot of effort into making sure that the management plan is applicable to the whole country. That said, anything that's in the management plan is voluntary. So this is not because Wolverines are not threatened yet. We don't know yet if they're threatened. We're looking at that too, because there's a chance that they might be threatened, which would mean that the government would have to do another plan, a recovery plan, which is much different than a management plan. So right now we're essentially just writing up what people should do, but it's probably already outdated by the time we've written it. But it's still a very good exercise in actually putting together all the science that we have, all the information we know, and making a plan. But hopefully, we've been trying to get British Columbia to also work on a management plan for Wolverines in the province that would be more like detailed and more applicable to the actual to these regions, and even within British Columbia, right? Like, what happens here might be very different than what happens in the North Coast. So the things that I talk about generally apply to this region. Some things are probably generally applicable, but we have to be careful not to think that something that we find here applies to the entire country, because there's just such big differences between places. So as a scientist, that's something we always keep in mind. Yeah.
Any last questions? Okay. Well, if no one has any more questions, we'll call it there. Thank you very much for attending, to all the guests, and thank you, Mirjam, so much for giving this talk for WildSite. It's been very insightful. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you all for coming, and thanks for putting it online afterwards. It's always nice to have somewhere where people can see those talks that haven't been able to make it.
Oh yeah, definitely. This will be available to watch again, and we'll post those books as well on Wolverines on the WildSite website, as are all of the winter speaker series. After they've happened, you can go back and watch them, or if you've missed any, they'll be available on the website to watch as well. Perfect. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Bye.